Augustine's Rule, a commentary by Adler Zumkeller OSA, Chapter 10, Fraternal or Sisterly Correction in the Monastery. Augustine's short rule for monastic life contains a rather lengthy chapter on fraternal or sisterly correction in the cloister. He regards such correction as an important service to the community. In this context, he does not limit his remarks to superiors for whom correction is an unpleasant task their office lays upon them. He believes, rather, that it can be incumbent upon every Christian and religious to give such an admonition or correction. What is the significance and importance of fraternal or sisterly correction? Let us listen first to what the Savior says on the subject. If your brother sins, go to him and correct him in private. If he heeds you, you have rescued your brother. Matthew 18:15. The Savior therefore regards correction as a work and duty of love. It springs from the responsibility we have for one another before God. And in fact, the Church has from the beginning considered properly exercised correction to be the most important of the spiritual works of mercy. St. Thomas calls it a spiritual alms that we bestow on our brother or sister. The moral theologians are convinced that this spiritual work of mercy is of greater value in God's sight than the corporal works of mercy such as care for the poor, the hungry, and the sick. In Augustine's view, correction that is properly done in the spirit of Christ is especially appropriate in monastic or religious life, where it helps the community to mature and serves to protect individuals in it. He too sees brotherly or sisterly correction as necessitated by our responsibility for one another. Exercise mutual vigilance, he tells us. In a monastery, none can excuse themselves, as Cain did, with the question, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Genesis 4:9. Yes, we are truly responsible before God for our brothers or sisters, not, of course, in the same sense that we exercise a burdensome tutelage over others, but in the sense that we show a loving concern for them. Augustine gives a fine explanation of this responsibility when he reminds us of the mystery which our community represents. God dwells in our hearts and in the community as such. We, therefore, perform a holy service on God's behalf, and even, we might say, in His place, when we exercise a loving care of one another, and, if need be, say a word of admonition to one another. Augustine is convinced that the prudent, discreet, and responsible practice of correction is not only useful, but necessary in religious life. Those at fault need it so that the beginning of evil will not grow more serious, but will be promptly corrected. But the community too is thereby preserved from harm, because correction ensures that many others may not be lost through their bad example. Paul's words, "When one member suffers, all the other members suffer with it." 1 Corinthians 12:26. These words apply especially to monasteries where so many persons live closely together and share a common life. St. Augustine knows only too well how difficult and unpleasant it is to have to admonish others, yet he sees it as a task we may not evade. But he also judges prudently exercised correction to be an appropriate means of promoting the growth and prosperity of that holy community, which is the goal of life in his foundations. He even makes correction an obligation in conscience. Yours is the greater blame if you allow your brothers or sisters to be lost through your silence when you are able to bring about their correction by your disclosure. To some extent, those who remain silent when they should speak share by their negligence in the sin and loss of others. He who does not impose discipline is cruel, says Augustine in Sermon 13. It is better to love and be hard than to be gentle and cause harm. Letter 93. He illustrates his meaning with a comparison. A person has suffered a bodily wound, but for fear of the pain which will accompany medical treatment, keeps the wound hidden and covered. Surely no one will accuse us of being unloving if we reveal the wound and perhaps save the person's life. On the contrary, we have acted mercifully. Neither then is the revelation and healing of spiritual wounds an act of an unloving person, and Augustine strongly rejects such an accusation. Those whose minds are earthbound will constantly voice that sort of suspicion, especially when the correction affects them personally. But the manifestation of another's fault is a service of true Christian love, provided, of course, that it is done in the spirit of love. In fact, even when someone proves incorrigible and must be expelled from the community, Augustine believes that the step is taken in a spirit not of cruelty but of compassion. How is correction to be given in a religious house? In this chapter of his rule, Augustine provides detailed guidelines for the proper way to go about it. He takes his cue from the instructions which the Saviour gave his disciples on fraternal or sisterly correction. The Lord speaks first of private correction. But what is to be done if this approach is fruitless? Jesus continues, if he does not listen, take one or two others along with you, that every word may be confirmed by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Matthew 18, verses 16 and 17. Augustine wants the same steps to be followed in the monastery. There is first to be a private admonition. If this proves useless and the brother or sister falls again, we should not give up and say nothing can be done. Superiors should be informed, and they must once again try to correct the problem in private. This second correction, though private, is already more of an official admonition. If this too proves fruitless, there should be no delay. The rule now provides for a formal judicial procedure that ends in a punishment. It is here that the rule mentions the priest for the first time. The latter plays the decisive role in the determination of the punishment. Not only had Augustine himself lived as a priest for several years in the lay monastery of Hippo, He seems also to have assigned a priest to the monastery of women in that city. This priest was to support the prioress with word and deed in these difficult areas of monastic government. Augustine also mentions the possibility of a monk or nun refusing to accept the punishment imposed. Such persons show themselves not only lacking in humility, but insubordinate and incorrigible. It is understandable, therefore, that in such cases Augustine should call for exclusion from the monastic community. In the passage already cited from Matthew, the Saviour himself orders that an incorrigible person is to be avoided like a Gentile and a tax collector. The reason Augustine gives for this final step is that many others may not be lost through their bad example. These instructions in the rule are not all still directly relevant to us today, because since Augustine's time, the Church itself has given detailed instructions for those difficult cases that require a formal trial before an ecclesiastical court. It is always painful when steps have to be taken to exclude a person from a religious order because of scandalous transgressions and an unwillingness to change. But cases do occur in which the Church sees itself obliged to intervene in this way in order to protect the religious community and do what it can for the eternal salvation of the guilty individual. It is important that correction be done at the proper time so that such an extreme situation will be avoided. Of course, correction will achieve its goal, which is the improvement of the person, only if it is done in the right spirit. Augustine insists that everything done must be done out of love for our fellows and a hatred of sin. Those who reprimand and warn must therefore always be conscious of their own weakness, so that, as he puts it on one occasion, mercy may pave the way for censure or reprimand. On the Sermon of the Mount 2:19. The thought of the danger that threatens the one who reprimands ensures proper understanding and compassion. Augustine sets it down as a basic principle that we should not undertake to correct others who have sinned unless we have first examined ourselves and can say in God's presence, I am doing this out of love. Love and love alone is allowed to use even harsh words. Augustine says, love and do what you will. Then words that sound harsh will not really be abusive. Explanation of the letter to the Galatians 57. The duty of correcting others will thus not only keep alive our sense of responsibility for the community as a whole, it will also continually inspire us to examine ourselves so that when we attend to the splinter in another's eye, we will not fail to see the beam in our own. Matthew 7:3. The spirit in which correction is accepted is a very important matter for a monastic community. The rule is silent on this point, requiring only that the person accept the atonement imposed. In most cases, of course, things will not go so far as to necessitate punishment, but even a simple admonition should not be met with resistance or rejection. Also worth noting is the exhortation which Augustine ends a letter saying, put greater effort into creating concord among you, than in correcting one another. We would misinterpret this chapter of the rule if we thought ourselves obliged to go around trying to criticize and improve everyone in the community. Furthermore, Augustine puts the emphasis on gentleness rather than severity in the exercise of monastic discipline. This is clear from the final paragraph of the chapter. He has spoken only of lustful glances, but perhaps the sinner has gone further than that. The rule mentions a situation in which a monk or nun has secretly received letters or gifts from a person of the other sex. The fault here is certainly worse than a sin of glance and desire, and would certainly call for a more severe punishment. Nonetheless, even here Augustine is prepared to forgive the fault and remit any punishment if the guilty come to their senses and freely acknowledge their offense.